Hey there, everybody! Welcome to another episode of the Arkham Sessions.
Hello.
I'm Brian Ward, and as always, I'm joined by Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Right.
Let's get into the episode. This week, we're talking about Vendetta, the first appearance of Killer Croc. Drea, this character's always been a personal fave of yours.
That's correct.
Why?
I tend to have a soft spot for the beasts, the monsters, the big kind of more innocent, not as intelligent villains of Gotham. And usually...
The
Lennies. Usually it's because they have a past. They have some kind of history of experiences, a lot of trauma, a lot of bullying, and social interactions that it doesn't necessarily excuse all of their misbehavior, but it provides an interesting lesson to us. And so I do enjoy talking about these more beast-like and fantastical types of villains because of the stories that they bring about.
So we're talking Killer Croc, we're talking the Penguin.
Clayface, for sure.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about a Killer Croc. His first appearance was in 1983, created by Jerry Conway and Gene Colan. Most people would say that his first appearance was in Batman number 358, but I am one of those sort of purists who credit Detective Comics number 524, which was actually a month earlier, because while you didn't really see him, it is him. He was sort of a shadowy figure, but... we didn't get a full glimpse of him. We didn't get a full look of him. We didn't get a full issue of him. That actually came in Batman 358. And this was a character that was born with a form of atavism, which is sort of a reverse evolution. And in the case of Waylon Jones, he took on the physical traits of a reptile. So let's talk about Vendetta a little bit. We open up and it's raining. And we're on a boat transporting a man by the name of Spider Conway, named after Jerry Conway. Spider's a criminal informant ready to tell all about his work with Rupert Thorne.
All he's got to do is make like a canary at the Crime Commission hearings, and he gets 10 years off his time.
That is until a mysterious figure comes up from the water and attaches a bomb to the side of the boat, blowing it to smithereens. Now, two things I noticed right off the bat during this scene. First... and you know I have to say it, Spider's a ginger. And second, the cop has a handlebar mustache. Now, I'm having a really hard time believing that this facial hair passes GCPD's personal appearance policy. Drea?
I personally did not notice this detail, and I have no problem with it.
And what about the ginger part?
That's totally expected.
Okay, all right. So when the smoke clears, we learn that Spider's missing, and Batman goes off to find him. Meanwhile, because of his close involvement with this case, Harvey Bullock is removed from it, much to his dismay, of course.
But if I let you go after Thorne, a lot of ugly ancient history is bound to come up.
And Batman actually begins investigating Bullock as a possible suspect in the bombing. And honestly, Bullock's sort of playing everything rather suspiciously, going in to find his own file to presumably hide information that may be in it, etc. And in that file, which Batman actually has, by the way, we learn that Bullock was suspected of taking graft from Thorne. And Batman thinks that Bullock stands to lose a lot should Spider Conway actually testify. That and finding a toothpick, Bullock's signature, at the site leads Batman to think that he's found his man. Batman wants to be sure, though, so we cut to Thorne being visited by Batman.
Did you order Spider Conway blown up?
That loser? I wouldn't wipe my shoes on him.
Thorne had nothing to do with the bombing of Spider's transport, and so Batman also investigates the wreckage and finds something. We're not entirely sure what it is at the time. But elsewhere, a second snitch, Joey, is being visited by someone who looks an awful lot like Bullock.
Rise and shine, Joey.
Who's there?
Your worst nightmare.
And he's kidnapped, and Bullock's then arrested. Batman investigates the thing he found on the wreckage and learns that it's a scale. The cellular structure is human, but the texture is reptilian, so it's kind of odd. Bruce then does his research.
Crocodiles make their lairs in underwater caves.
Of course.
Yeah, so Batman, of course, goes looking and honestly finds it pretty quickly.
Well, I think he knows where all the underwater layers are, surrounding Gotham City.
Quite possibly. Killer Croc's lair is, of course, where he ends up, and he also finds Spider and Joey. Within moments, Croc attacks and nearly drowns Batman, and here we learn
They used to call Killer Croc the meanest dude in the Wrestling Federation.
but Batman does manage to escape with both of Croc's prisoners. We then learn more about Killer Croc.
He started out a carnival sideshow attraction, then became a pro wrestler. 2 years later, Croc had moved to Gotham City and turned to crime.
Bullock arrested him, and now he appears to be framing Bullock as revenge, hence the title of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
Bullock is released from jail on bond, and Croc carjacks him. Of course, Batman ends up carjacking both of them by appearing in the back seat, and still Croc manages to escape into the sewer. This is when a crucial piece of information about Croc comes across.
But hey, I'm adaptable. When you grow up looking like I do, you gotta learn to go with the flow.
Now, Drea, let's talk about this, because this is probably the key line in the entire episode as it relates to Killer Croc's psyche.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, it's such a meaningful statement because he's referring to the fact that he basically was born with this defect or this deformity, right? That he has or had no control of how he looked, and he was treated a certain way because of his physical appearance. And naturally, what I'm hearing him say there is, I had to work with what I had, and for me, that meant going into a life of criminality. Starting off with being exploited, but still getting some attention, some social value as a circus performer, then finding some kind of value as a pro wrestler. Again, using his strengths being his strange appearance, his size, his
Physical
disfigurement.
strength.
His physical strength, for sure. And then turning to crime, turning to unlawful acts, taking advantage of others, and that being something that he had to do to get by. So I think in that single statement, he's basically saying, because I'm different, I go by a different set of rules, and I did what I had to survive.
So, in your experience, while you've not necessarily dealt with anyone with atavism or anything such as this, you certainly have dealt with people, both children and adults, who might have this sort of personality. What do you look for, and how do you go about treating this sort of thing before it gets to a point that now this alienated person has gone down a bad path and is suddenly, criminal?
Yeah. Well, I think the main theme of this episode for me is that physical and medical conditions are very much linked to psychological conditions.
Right.
And I'm going to say what I say often, which is it's very complicated. So we have talked before about changes in psychological adjustment following disfigurement. Remember Two-Face? He was Harvey Dent. He was, can I say, normal looking.
Right.
He was
even very attractive. He was on the
incredibly
reverse side
attractive, right,
of where he ended up.
Then he experienced this incredible trauma and was thereafter disfigured and was never the same psychologically. And one can argue that simply being born with some kind of deformity or physical abnormality isn't much different than that.
Right.
But I would actually argue that while there isn't necessarily a discrete or identifiable trauma, like with Harvey Dent, there is that long-standing experience of physically living in that body that people socially respond to in a certain way.
Right.
So I find that almost in a way there's very similar reactions, like we talked about with Two-Face, but also we have this physical trauma, if you will, occurring at a very young age. Of course, because Killer Croc was born with this particular, we can call it a medical, it's a medical condition, right? So
that's an interesting point. I mean, up to this point, we've always seen the Rogues Gallery as they have become who they were. We've seen Jonathan Crane become Scarecrow. We have heard the story of Clayface. We have seen Poison Ivy. We have seen these characters. The only other character I can think of that might have applied in this way would be maybe Oswald Cobblepot, the Penguin.
Absolutely.
But he didn't really seem to be affected by this. This is the first time that we're seeing a character who was born this way and has been living this way his entire life.
Right.
So, and still seems to be affected by it psychologically. Talk about the difference between growing up this way and it suddenly happening to you in the case of Harvey Dent.
Well, one huge body of study actually comes from this saying, beautiful is good. Have you ever heard that before?
Yeah, why can't you be like the beautiful kid over there?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, then you might relate to this idea. That saying, beautiful is good, comes from this, as I said, this huge body of research that looked into level of attractiveness and expectations or perceptions of people. And many, many studies have actually shown that people tend to link physical attractiveness with all of these positive attributes and characteristics, regardless of any connection. So, for instance, people who are seen as very handsome or beautiful are considered to be more socially adept, are considered to be more intelligent, are considered to have good behavior, so to speak, aren't likely to engage in criminal activity or misbehave or anything. And a lot of studies actually looked at school-age children, and those studies showed that teachers rated more attractive students as higher on certain abilities and rated unattractive students as being poor academically and also having higher rates of misbehavior. And let me clarify that those students didn't actually have higher rates of misbehavior or were, failing or getting bad grades. The expectation from the teachers was the more attractive students would be successful, and the unattractive students would be misbehaving, wouldn't be doing well in school, wouldn't be popular.
So in the same way, I mean, I can get the expectation for a beautiful kid to be popular. Obviously, those are the kids that are going to attract other people, not just physically, but I mean, the captain of the football team is always the most popular of the jocks, and he's always the good-looking, all-American kid. The prom king and the prom queen are probably going to be the more beautiful couple in your school. So that I certainly get. The other things I find interesting is that it's just assumed that the good-looking kids will do better in school or whatever. And I don't know, not because I know the truth, but because I would think the stereotype would go the other way, that the nerdier kids would be the academics, would be the ones who have nothing to do but go home and study, are going to be the ones that excel in school.
Right. Well, and I think when you say the nerdier kids, I mean, are you really just saying the kids who were
I'm saying
smaller,
the stereotype.
The kids who were not as attractive, the kids who didn't have as many friends. You're actually talking about a lot of different variables.
The Sherwoods.
Sure, right. From I've Got Batman in My Basement. And you're getting at something that's really important, which is the complexity of interactions between physical attractiveness, social interaction, mood and affect, someone's reaction to their social interactions, and then the adjustment or the response to that. Specific studies also found that in contrast, individuals with a visible physical deformity are often met with social uncertainty and sometimes hostility. And that makes sense. Kids don't know how to respond and process someone that looks quite different from them,
right,
and someone who has, if you will, a deformity. And in fact, in social situations, a physical difference is met with curiosity, staring, some interactions, bullying, things that can lead to very uncomfortable interactions between, a person with normal physical development and a person with abnormal physical development. So that is to say that, going back to what I said before about this being very complicated, and I think my message probably for this podcast is not unlike what I've said before, but this is particularly complex when you really look at all the factors involved. Kids that grow up with medical illnesses and in particular visible deformities or conditions often have a co-occurring psychiatric disorder. That is to say, oftentimes there's anxiety, there's depression, there's some kind of affective or anxious response.
And unfortunately, this disorder could have been sort of put upon them by society around them. The expectations, what people saw, the staring, the expecting that person to fail or to be weird, could have given them this anxiety or this disorder.
Absolutely. And you're totally on point. That's what I really want to emphasize is that, as a reminder, there are biological, behavioral, cognitive, and social pathways that contribute to the co-occurrence of medical and psychiatric problems. That's what I meant, like it's very complicated. So let me give you an example. That was jargon for most people, I think. So let me give you an example. Disfigurement, let's say what Killer Croc was suffering from, this very visible physical abnormality on his skin. That could lead to some cognitive distortions or what we would consider some, irrational and negative thinking about himself. I'm not good enough. I'm very different. So that means I'm less than. I'm not valued. I'm being punished by God. I'm being punished by some other, higher power. I don't deserve what everyone else deserves. So those are clearly unfair, but could be some of his natural cognitive distortions. And that could lead to a lot of distress. Also something we call perceived stress, that if he's thinking all those things, now we know not all those things are true, but if he's thinking all of those things, he can perceive a large amount of stress, which may not necessarily be founded, and a loss of control. So these are all things that he may feel like he can't control. And finally, those thoughts about the self threaten his own self-esteem, his own self-value.
Right.
And then those thoughts...
Plus, he's grown up his entire life as a spectacle, not just to kids around him or to people around him on the street, but I mean, he was actually he grew up in a carnival as a sideshow spectacle. Then he went from that into professional wrestling. He's always been entertainment. He's always been something intended for people to look at and gawk at.
And so his value then, what society values in him, at least the lessons he's learning, is that my entire worth is in my physical appearance.
Right.
But not that it's beautiful. It's odd, bizarre, but has this sort of like monetary, it has this value, economical value that people might want.
It makes you wonder then why Croc has spent... Now, I realize that in the real world, it's because of the reveal in the third act. But it makes you wonder why he has spent this much time throughout this episode in the shadows. of course, he's setting up Harvey Bullock. He is
Right.
dressing as Harvey. He is putting himself in a position where he is unable to be seen throughout the majority of the episode.
Right.
But you would think that someone who has this superhuman toughness and strength, and really everything he knows about himself is that level of spectacle about his appearance, you would think that this guy would come right out and be brash and be criminal.
He probably is at times, but that brings me to that other pathway I mentioned, that emotional and behavioral pathway. So I said it's very complicated. We talked about some of those negative thoughts you could have. Those negative thoughts about the self and learning about what society thinks of him can actually lead to affective disturbances. Mainly, I mean things like anxiety and depression. That should make sense, right? If I feel bad about myself, I don't have self-value, I feel like I'm not worthy. People care about my exterior, but inside, no one cares about who I am, who I really am. And when someone feels so invisible and unseen, they then develop feelings of depression, feelings of suicidality, feelings of social anxiety, and self-hatred. And those are problematic, and those can lead to behavioral responses like isolation, being withdrawn, and some of this criminal activity we see. When I do interact with people, I'm going to take advantage of them, or when I do interact with people, I'm going to be aggressive and use my physical strength and my fear-inspiring persona to get what I want, because they're not going to see me for me anyway. So it makes sense. It's actually called maladaptive coping responses to engage in misbehavior, to engage in addictive, dangerous things that we do, impulsive things that we do that don't do us any good, but we found that they get us to what we want immediately.
So it's actually the antithesis of what he said about his entire life being able to adapt. He's actually pretty maladaptive.
He's actually right.
Oh.
I'm glad you brought that back. When he says, I'm being adaptive, he is totally spot on. He is adapting. This is what the world thinks of me. This is the way society wants to treat me. I'm going to go along with it. I'm going to use it to my advantage so that I don't completely, become nothing. And so, yes, on the one hand, he's probably depressed. He's probably isolated. He probably is very lonely. But on the other hand, he's taking some control.
And he's doing exactly what society tells him he should be doing.
And you're spot on. Those are the expectations society has on him. He's going to go ahead and do it so that he can have some benefit from it. And again, it really, this is why I like this kind of character. There's just so much interesting stuff there.
He's not just what people call a psychopath who is running amok around the streets. He is someone with a story, and unfortunately, part of that story is what we have done to him.
Yeah, it's sort of like it's kind of our fault that he's the way he is. We all have some responsibility. And he's not just some mindless, unintelligent thug. He's particularly emotional. He's somewhat intelligent. He's not super smart, but there's stuff happening there, and I think that makes him very interesting as a character. So all of this that we've been talking about is actually best illustrated by these couple of case studies that The Psychologist, this British magazine, published a couple of years ago, and it's actually written by these two guys, James Partridge, who was very severely burned in an accident, and basically his life changed as an adult. And then this other man, Adam Pearson, who from birth has suffered from this condition called neurofibromatosis, which basically means he had all of these sort of this extra tissue and essentially tumors growing from his body. It was a very visible disfigurement. And
wasn't this Elephant Man's disease?
Yes, it is. And what's interesting is that they both talk about how society reacts to them when they see them. And I just want to read their accounts because it's a better explanation of what I just gave. It's basically a realistic description of that very complicated social interaction, expectation, perception, self-esteem, threat, all those things that I talked about. So this issue of adjustment is addressed. And James talks about the twin processes involved in adjusting to a disfigurement. The twin processes are the self-confidence and self-esteem. The difference between that is self-confidence is one's ability to project oneself in social situations, and self-esteem is that inner sense of self-worth. And James said, I experimented with different levels of eye contact, handshake, verbal energy, and body language, and found out and eventually mastered the skills to deal with the scaredness I met. Scared being an acronym for staring, curiosity, anguish, recoil, embarrassment, and dread. These skills mediated the effect of my outside and boosted my inside too. So he's essentially dealing with these reactions from people. Okay. And then Adam, who I believe, based on the pictures I've seen, who has a much more, well, he has a more long-standing physical disfigurement because he was born with this disease.
He's never known what it was like
exactly
to not have it.
Exactly. He said, I discovered how to control a social situation. Just going up to someone who is staring or acting funny and saying hi is a really good way of breaking the ice and showing your human side. Having just been through the university system, I also meet hundreds of new people. So unless I've been able to introduce myself in a confident way, I doubt I would have found the experience anywhere near as fulfilling as I did. What Adam is essentially saying is, rather than react, he's had a lifetime to learn this.
Right.
Rather than react with, just withdrawing and feeling ashamed and not correcting their beliefs.
A Frankenstein's monster approach.
I have to just face it. And in fact, this article, which can be found online, says, they live in a society that prizes good looks. Of course, this is the society we live in. Mm-hmm. And the society makes people with disfigurements vulnerable to feelings of inferiority and inadequacy from which low self-esteem stems. So if the equation between looks and success is not effectively debunked, a person's morale can plummet. Anxiety, depression, and of course, suicide can follow. So it really stresses the importance of interacting with others and really trying to correct those misconceptions about who that person is, under that exterior. And so it's like I said, their real accounts better describe and exemplify in their words that very complicated interaction between the self and society and those expectations.
Gotcha. So we take it back to the episode. The battle, of course, at the end of every episode. This one ends in the sewer, and the sewer crashing in. Batman hauls out Killer Croc. Bullock is, of course, there waiting. Now, this is an interesting point because up to this point, Bullock has looked at Batman the same way that we are all looking at Killer Croc, as this abnormality, as this thing that needs to be brought in. He must be bad because he's a vigilante. He's got to let the cops do their jobs, or whatever. Meanwhile, this entire episode, partially because of the way Bullock has treated Batman, I think, Batman has been looking at Bullock as the villain, as the potential suspect, as the man who clearly with a hard shell and is a bit too gruff to be a good cop, must be corrupt. He's looking at him a completely different way. The two of them are sort of turned on their ears in this moment. Bullock acknowledges Batman by letting him go. by letting him leave the scene. Batman acknowledges Bullock.
Why? Why'd you stick your neck out like that to help me?
Because I thought you were guilty too. And I was wrong.
Yeah.
And all of this while Croc is unconscious on the ground, waiting to be arrested and taken in for his crimes. So, threefold, this story is all about perceptions, what those perceptions do to those characters, and, etc. I think it was...
Wow, really nice, Brian.
It was a very good ending to this episode.
Yeah, well, no one's a monster. Everybody has these notions about each other. Everyone's feeling threatened by each other. Everyone's suspicious. And you're absolutely right. I think you have a really, a great kind of perspective about how everyone was knocked on their ass at the end. Like, I was completely wrong.
But at the same time, we the audience from episode 1, from On Leather Wings, we have not liked Bullock.
Oh, I hate him.
Because Bullock is out for Batman, our hero.
Right.
We have never liked him. However, at the very end of this episode, Bullock exclaims,
Bullock's back and ready to kick butt.
and we feel for him. We're ready for him to go kick butt.
Yeah.
Like, we are also elated by this. So this episode has turned us around on Bullock.
Yeah.
Even if it's just for the amount of time between this episode and the next. Because who knows how we're going to feel about Harvey Bullock going forward. But at least now we understand a couple of things. And this is very important for the fact that this particular show deals with one episode at a time, but also deals with the past episodes as history.
Right.
We now have a little bit of history on Bullock. We also know that Bullock is a good cop. That Gordon, who defended him earlier on, was right. Gordon has been able to see into Harvey Bullock. He is gruff. He is tough. He is not someone with whom you want to trifle. However, he's not on the take. He has not made money off of Rupert Thorne. He wants crime to go down in Gotham City.
Right.
And so while he's not necessarily on the Batman side, he's a good guy.
Right.
And
in a weird way, they can relate to each other. They have very different methods.
Oh, yeah.
They don't get along.
They'll both beat you up, though.
Right.
If necessary.
Yeah. But I think at the end of the day, they realize that ultimately they have the same mission, which is to keep people safe and to put criminals away. And I think they related. They were able to see eye to eye. They related to that. And yeah, that was really interesting to see.
So yeah, I really liked the end of that episode, and the episode itself was pretty good. Of course, the fact that the snitch was a ginger. I'm going to ignore that part because I liked the end of the episode so much.
You can ignore that.
So let's talk a little bit, as we like to do, about real life situations. Now, you just brought up a couple of real life situations of people who have dealt with abnormalities or deformities, someone who was burned, and then also someone who was born with Elephant Man's disease.
And both who I should have mentioned have really overcome their adversity and who have been very successful. So it shows that I think you don't have to become Killer Croc.
Right.
In that, you don't have to turn to that criminal side. Or
in the real life case that I'm about to talk about, you don't have to become Killer Croc, or you don't have to become Grady Stiles, a.k.a. the Lobster Boy. Grady Stiles Jr., son of Grady Stiles Sr., obviously, who also had this defect known as ectrodactyly. Basically, it gives you claw-like hands. So you've got these, for lack of a better word, two fingers that sort of come together like pinchers, like claws. Mm-hmm. This is a guy who was born into the carnival sideshow lifestyle. His father was, and then he was, and at a very early age, well before his teens. In fact, I believe he was only I think if I remember correctly, he was only like 6 or 7 when he got into being billed as Lobster Boy. He was doing the circuit as this carnival sideshow freak, as they called them back then. And he actually sort of grew up and married another carnival performer. And really, throughout his life, whether it was the way he was raised or gawked at or whatever, was just a hateful man. Nobody liked Lobster Boy. He was not a pleasant person to be around. He was a heavy drinker, and his bottom half was equally deformed. He basically had, I guess, what would be considered flippers for legs. So he couldn't walk. Therefore, his upper body gained this almost superhuman strength, so much so that the pinchers that you would think would be sort of problematic for him to do any danger with were actually quite dangerous. He was quite powerful with his hands. And
would he snap?
He would, in fact... No, you know what? We in the industry don't like to say snap.
Oh.
No.
I don't mean psychologically. I meant
I understand.
like, would
Yes,
he
I
snap
understand.
at people? Like you say he was... I
No.
was trying to make a joke, too. Cause
He would
had
pinch.
These, like,
He would
pinchies.
pinch. He would actually... he had what people said were vicious pinches. And of course... hitting. He would hit people, punch people. He was also known for headbutting people.
Wow.
He was not a nice guy, really, by any account. So, how he managed to woo a wife, but he had 4 children. 2 of the children also ended up coming up with that same congenital defect. So he had 2 lobster children and then 2 normal, quote unquote, normal children. But eventually his wife decided she had had enough. She left him. They divorced, and she remarried. And at some point in time decided that relationship wasn't good enough for her, or she got bored or something. She divorced that husband, got back together with Grady.
What?
Remarried Grady.
What? There was something about
him.
Pinchers.
And he was famous for, in interviews and with people to whom he talked, and he didn't talk to very many people, but when he did, he would often brag about lobster sex.
What?
Oh yes, he would brag about lobster sex. So the thing about Grady, though...
Wait, what does that mean?
I didn't have it with him. I don't know what it means.
Okay.
I only know that he was quite proud of it.
All right.
And he did have 4 children. So, but here's the thing, is he was apparently overheard on several drunken occasions threatening to kill his wife.
Oh.
And, as a result of this, she and her son from another marriage ended up paying a 17-year-old neighbor, and some say carnival worker as well, though I don't know that I've ever been able to find out what exactly he did. But he was a 17-year-old neighbor to go and kill her husband.
Okay.
And he did. He walked into their home. The door was open. He walked into their home, shot Grady in the back of the head. Now, Grady was so unliked when he died, they couldn't find anyone willing to be a pallbearer. So he was a very horrible person. But and by the way, I left out the most interesting and potentially most validating reason for killing Grady, beside the fact that he had threatened to kill his wife. He had killed before.
What?
His daughter was engaged to be married. He didn't like the guy, and the night before their wedding, shot him to death with a shotgun.
Gosh.
This is the kicker, though. And it's stories like this, which is why I'm so fascinated with this lifestyle, which luckily has been banned. The carnival sideshows have really been banned. But he was let off. He openly admitted to the crime. Everyone knew he did it, and he had no problem saying that he did it to the police, to the judge, to the jury. Mm-hmm. He was let off with 15 years probation. Why? This is a very Gotham City-esque story. There were no prisons equipped to handle his defect. Mm. So no one could take care of him. Mm. Therefore, we're going to let you go.
Wow.
So...
I mean, what do they really need? He can't hold a fork, so they need proper utensils.
I guess it's very much like Mr. Freeze. If you don't have a cell that's equipped to handle ectrodactyly, you really can't have him in prison. Maybe. Wow. I have no idea. All I know is it is a bizarre case. And yet, similar to, and by the way, may I just say, as you have said on several occasions, of all the research that I have done over the years, and certainly in preparation for this particular show, Grady Stiles is the only carnival sideshow performer that I have been able to find who has a legitimate criminal record. So it's not to say that if you grew up a sideshow freak, you became a killer, or you became a bank robber, or you became Killer Croc. But he did. Mm-hmm. And that's why I illustrate the Killer Croc persona with Grady Stiles Jr. in this particular episode.
Yeah.
So that's that.
Really good point to make, too, that he's probably an exception to the degree that he's engaged in such serious violent crimes.
So we just want to make it clear that these people with these abnormalities are not bad people.
Right. And
but he did grow up in this lifestyle. So similar to Killer Croc.
Yeah.
He grew up with these problems.
Right.
But so did two of his kids who didn't have this issue. They have not. In fact, one of them has gone on to be sort of an actress. You can actually see her in the movie Big Fish, which is a movie about sort of sideshow. Several of the cast members are sideshow freaks.
Yeah.
She is in Big Fish, and she's been in a number of other productions that require people like that. But
right. And just like the two guys that I mentioned, one who was seriously injured and deformed from an accident that involved third-degree burns all over his body, he went on to become CEO of an incredibly successful company rather than becoming someone like Harvey Dent, who engages in this, a very violent criminal activity.
Right.
So I completely agree, and again emphasize the complexity of all of these different variables and factors interacting with each other, and that some pathways lead to destruction and pathology.
By the way, just as a side note, Grady was killed in 1992. Guess how much it cost to kill him? This is how badly the man was hated.
I don't know.
$1,500.
What?
For $1,500, a man would go and shoot your husband just because nobody liked him. So, anywho. Pathways.
Another pathways can lead to overcoming negativity and adversity, and I just think, can we just end on Killer Croc's statement about adapting? Because that sentence, that announcement couldn't be more true.
Right.
That he is adapting, and just like the person who adapts toward the direction of learning lessons and being brave and facing, that social interaction and helping people to understand their situation and maybe having a successful life versus adapting in a much different direction. That announcement that Killer Croc makes couldn't be more true, that it really captures the complexity of everything going on.
Right.
So let's end on that.
We will. Join us next week when we take a look at Fear of Victory, another fantastic episode. Drea, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure. Where can people find you on Twitter?
My Twitter name is @ArkhamAsylumDoc.
You can find me at bward028, or you can find the show at Arkham Sessions. On Twitter, you can also find us on Facebook, so come and like us there. And as always, I highly recommend that you reach out to us via email through arkhamsessions@gmail.com, or go to Andrea's website, underthemaskonline.com, and email her there. Plus, there's a lot to look at there. Drea?
It's time for lobster sex.
All right, so...
Just kidding. It was a great pleasure. Excited for next week.
Yep. So until then, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are...
The Arkham Sessions.